Just to kick this off, like, listen, you have a long view on analytics and data from Elastic, and so I thought maybe it'd be worth just going through your background, kind of the more personal level, and then how you've seen data, especially real-time data, change up to this point.
Sure. So a bit about my background. I started my career in technology in the mid-90s, to date myself, at Sun Microsystems when I was in university. And then I went to work at PeopleSoft as a consultant.
Was it in Pleasanton?
It was in Pleasanton. They got acquired by Oracle eventually. And then in early 2002, I met with Mark Benioff, and he offered me a job as a sales engineer, what people now call a solution architect. And I did technical pre-sales there for a short period of time, and then I moved into sales management. And then I spent 12 years at Salesforce before joining Elasticsearch, which I think most of you are familiar with. And I spent 6 years there overseeing the go-to-market functions. And then I stepped out during COVID and spent a year forming ClickHouse. And so that's a bit about my background. In terms of Martine's question around analytics and real time, I think we've all seen the shift, especially over the last 5 years, away from batch and towards real time. So we're not the only company or technology talking about this. There's a lot of movement in the area, but especially over the last 24 months with just the emergence of these AI workloads, we've seen just a massive amount of demand to move away from batch reporting. So we can spend a few minutes talking about that.
It is interesting, actually. So, but I'm not just going to grill you this entire time. We'll turn this into a conversation. But since you brought it up, we have a very broad view of companies at Andreessen Horowitz. And of course, there's the new wave of AI companies. And one thing that I actually have noticed, and this is not a setup, I promise, is that there's a lot of ClickHouse use. And at first I was like, what are they using ClickHouse for? Because these are these kind of inference platforms. And so maybe it's worth actually just talking about the relevance of ClickHouse for these modern, and maybe just real-time data generally, just so it isn't kind of super product specific, because it wasn't obvious to me until you told me.
Well, it's interesting. When I was forming the company, I reached out to Martine. Martine was an early investor in a company called Imply, which is behind the open source project Druid. And I said, I'd like to get your perspective on this technology. And so he invited me over, and we sat in his backyard, and we talked about these various open source OLAP databases, because he knew the market extremely well, and I was coming up to speed on it. I'd seen ClickHouse emerge when I was at Elastic. We started to lose some pretty prominent workloads, so I was familiar with the technology. At the time, we were really primarily focused on Splunk and on AWS's redistribution of Elasticsearch. And so I really didn't appreciate the diversity of the use cases that ClickHouse supports. And so that was a bit of a journey for me of discovery over the course of that year. So maybe I can just get a gauge of the audience. Who here is familiar with ClickHouse? So that's about half the audience. Who here is a user of ClickHouse? Okay, so about 10 of you. And what I discovered was the use cases really fall in three distinct areas. The first is observability, which is where I first observed it when I was at Elasticsearch, and that's logs, metrics, and traces. The second is a data warehouse use case, and ClickHouse is short for Clickstream Data Warehouse. So my co-founder, Alexei, when he created the technology and he named it, he was already thinking about the data warehouse use case. It was originally designed to sit behind something called Yandex Metrica, which is the equivalent of Google Analytics. And I think most of you have probably used Google Analytics. So this is web scale analytics. You're querying petabytes of data. You've got high concurrency and low latency requirements. That's the second use case, the data warehouse use case. And then the third is this broad kind of real-time analytics, and that's typically customer-facing. It could be internally facing, but it's typically a B2B SaaS application. And examples of that in this AI world would include, LangChain, weights and biases, Vercel, and others, where you're exposing data, some analytical experience to your end users. You could have tens of thousands of concurrent users. You're querying petabytes of historical and real-time data that's streaming in. So a pretty complex engineering a challenge.
You know, we were actually talking in the car on the way up here. And so I've been tracking the data space for at least a decade, and there's always been this kind of promise for real-time OLAP-y, you know, like you always say it, but historically it's been a pretty tough market because, like, listen, you've got the cloud data warehouses, and like batch is a very large market, and there's been a number of companies that have like done a pretty good job, but like there's been a ceiling, you know, and so. It feels different now, but actually, like for the first time, like, you know, there's a lot of pull. And so, I mean, is it just we waited long enough? Is there something structurally different? Like, why do you think it's different now?
You know, I'm going to turn that question around to you. And because you've been an investor, you know, there's probably few people in the world that understand the data space as well as Martin. Very modest. I mean, he had a PhD from Stanford in computer science, in software-defined networking. I think Pete credentialed him, started Nicira, sold that to VMware for $1.2 billion, which at the time was a monumental outcome, and spent 5 years there before leaving and joining Andreessen, where he's been for the last 9 years. And I think when he left VMware, the product line that he was responsible for was doing $1 billion of revenue. And he's, you know, early investor in various companies that recently have had great exits, like Isovalent, which was acquired by Cisco, and Tabular, acquired by Databricks, where he's also, I believe, an advisor to the CEO of that company. So he knows the category very well. I mentioned the history with Druid. And so at least what I observed, and I think you're in a better position to comment on this, is, you know, historically you've had these like purpose-built databases for specific use cases. And, you know, ClickHouse historically was an OLAP database, so an analytical database. You've got transactional databases, you've got relational, and you've got, you know, more specialized databases like a vector database. And at least what I started to see was kind of the convergence of these technologies, where they were on a bit of a collision course. And what I hear from customers almost every day is the desire to move away from all of these specialized databases and to have fewer databases inside of an enterprise that support multiple use cases. So maybe a question to you, as you look at these companies, as you make these investments, like, how do you see the database market evolving over the next, 3 to 5 years? Because that's kind of, it's your job to like look out that far and predict the future.
Yeah. I mean, I've learned to hate databases. They're tough. So let's talk about the OLAP space, and then I'll kind of back it into the OLTP space. So for the OLAP space, I actually think the answer is the pattern has matured. Meaning, in the past, if you're writing an app and you wanted like to collect data to like analyze it for whatever, you would throw it into Postgres. And there's just a lot of that, right? Which is OLTP and it's slow. And we've just kind of been evolving as an industry, like just throw it into something that's faster, query it. Like the users are expecting logs, the users have become more sophisticated. And so I just honestly think this is just kind of this natural wave to embedding a database in. And then I think the market is large. And I do think that like AI as a macro trend really accelerates this, because there's just so much that's going on and it's so fast. I mean, there's so much inference that happens that there's really no analog in the traditional compute world. And so, I think very much the OLAP thing is real, and it's becoming like a core piece of how you build an app, just like a database was a core piece of like OLTP was. And I think that like what you used to abuse OLTP for, now you use OLAP for. So I think that's just a very natural progression that we've all been tracking. What's really interesting to me on the databases, it feels like now OLTP is being unbundled, which is, apps need transactions, and they don't just need it over data, they need transactions. Like if I'm trying to do 3 things, like a shopping cart, like I didn't need to make sure that I complete all of them. And so we're starting to see early signs of this kind of unbundling, things like Cadence, the company Temporal, Ingest. We're starting to see, like if I'm, like app developers need the type of database guarantees, but for actually traditional programming logic. And so that's a very, very interesting space to track. And so I think we're still like very much in the middle of massive transformations. I think OLAP is going to continue to be a very, very large space, and that's clearly just growing because it is a key piece. But I also almost feel like the data, like the OLTP is going to broaden so that, like key logic, like it's going to be unbundled, and like the actual transactional component is going to be pulled out, and that's going to be also a key component of how we write software programs. By the way, we're actually going to do a Q&A too at the end of this, if anybody have any questions for what we cover.
So to further the question, probably 4 or 5 years ago, Andreessen authored a blog and a diagram they referred to as the modern data stack. I think probably many of us read that and referenced it.
Yeah.
And a question to you, you're on the board of companies like DBT and Fivetran and Cursor, which is experiencing just sensational growth. Kind of looking back on when that was authored relative to today, what has changed? Hey, maybe what were you right about?
Yeah.
And those trends played out as predicted. Where were you wrong?
Yeah.
Where you maybe didn't predict the emergence of some of these AI technologies that disrupted the stack that you defined it as.
Yeah.
And if you were to redesign it today, what would it look like?
So at the time, the modern data stack was very clear. There was like this emergence of like the cloud data warehouse. It was largely spurred by Snowflake, Redshift, and BigQuery. And there's a new set of companies that were like part of this wave. And we actually just talked to a bunch of practitioners and we're like, what does your stack look like? And there's just like a lot of similarity. And so we wrote about that. That's what the modern data stack was. And so I think what we got right was like, this is a massive wave. A lot of people are using it and it continues to be, right? So that's all fine. What I think we got wrong is it felt like at the time that was going to be the new focal point of building an application. Like there's going to be a whole set of applications which are basically wrappers on top of like a cloud data warehouse, and maybe you'd have some HTTP, OLTP-ish thing, and like that's the new kind of CRUD stack. So I'm like, okay, hooray, CRUD is gone. This is the new way you're going to do it, and that ecosystem is going to play out. And I think that would have happened but for AI. Like I think but for AI, and by AI I mean like the Gen stuff, like Gen AI stuff, like and so I think like that world was going. Like these companies were growing in popularity and they were using it, the pattern would show up, and we'd have companies all the time come up to Andreessen Horowitz and they're like, we're basically a CRUD layer on top of Snowflake, and but I don't think people really appreciate to the extent this Gen AI stuff is changing everything. I mean, it's so dramatic. Like the last time I remember it feeling like this is in the late 90s, and I'm not old. I mean, it's just when the consumption layer to computers changed. When the internet, the consumption layer was now in a browser. When it changes, like everything changes about it, like how you think about an app, how you interact, how you build it, and so forth. And so I can't, probably for the first time in 25 years, I feel like I can't really predict where things are going, but I know the consumption layer is changing. And by consumption layer, I mean like a human being goes to a computer, they put their hands on the keyboard, like what do they interact with and what does that look like? Like is CRUD gonna survive vibe coding? Probably, but what it'll look like, I don't really know, right? Like, there are these very open questions that we as an industry don't even know. They're very technical questions, like to what extent can you use natural language to build formal systems? Like I'm very much in the camp of you can't. Like formal systems are formal, and like you need to speak of it in a certain way. And so, I mean, I know I'm kind of going off on like maybe more of a philosophical tangent, but what was pretty predictable, and I could have shown you evidence and I could have shown you data for before, I can't now. And all I can do is point to this crazy growth period where everything seems to be working. So I'll just give you an anecdote about the AI stuff. So we had our offsite recently, the Andreessen Horowitz offsite, and we put together all of this data, all the data that we have on these Gen AI companies, and the idea was to come up with a thesis of what's going on. Like to your question, like what's the thesis? And that's what we do. We do VCs, we do thesis. And I realized that every thesis worked because like everything is kind of working. Like everything's kind of growing so fast and everything's so chaotic that like we can fool ourselves into understanding what's going on. But it really felt like you're staring into some fractal self-similar system. I mean, you can make an argument that there's no defensibility. You can make an argument that there is defensibility. You can make an argument that value is accruing to silicon. You can make an argument that the app layer will get it. And so if you go on X and everybody has their theory about defensibility, non-defensibility, let me tell you, the data doesn't, it supports all of it and none of it. So we're at a period that we don't really know what's going on with the market. And so listen, I actually want to push it back to you. So having 2 weeks from actually looking at all of the milieu of chaos and being who knows, you have to actually build a business in all of that. So how are you thinking about the disruption? How are you planning on navigating it? How is it impacting? I mean, I think it's actually a pretty key question for anybody in the industry right now, given a macro shift.
Yeah, maybe I'll broaden my response a little bit. So, I kind of think about our company as, picks and shovels to this AI movement, in the sense that these applications are generating a tremendous amount of data. That data needs to be analyzed in real time, and real time as defined by 50 to 100 milliseconds, let's say. And there's very few technologies that can, store and analyze and process the volumes of data that these agents are generating, and ClickHouse is one of them. And so when we started the company, it was before ChatGPT, but ClickHouse had been used for a lot of inference training and ML workloads ahead of that. And so we said, all right, we need to come up with a business model. Historically, so ClickHouse is an open source database under an Apache 2 license. Historically, open source business models, as everybody knows, you sell technical support, you have proprietary features or an enterprise version, you bundle it as a subscription, and then you subsequently stand up a managed service. And it's a well-known playbook. Mongo is probably the best of the bunch. They've been at it the longest with their Atlas service, which is now doing over $1 billion of recurring revenue. You've got Confluent Cloud and Elastic Cloud, probably the three most successful now public companies, with HashiCorp getting acquired by IBM. And so, having been through that journey at Elastic, and we built a very strong business selling on-prem or self-managed support subscriptions with some proprietary features, and we took the company public, and then there was this big shift towards the cloud. And so we try to pivot the business and our customer base to move these managed services. It's very difficult, as everybody knows. And so when we were coming up with a strategy, we decided simply to start with a managed service that we call ClickHouse Cloud. And we had, the reality is, hosting and offering a database as a managed service is A, not that difficult, and B, not that differentiated. And that's what we learned at Elastic, because AWS, because of these very permissive open source licenses, can redistribute your technology. And these large cloud providers are very effective at meeting customer demand. So if there's a lot of pull from the market for an open source technology, it's not uncommon for these CSPs to offer this technology as a managed service. And in fact, it's competitive, obviously, for the company behind that technology. And so we actually spent a year redesigning our actual table engine to enable the separation of compute and storage. And I'll credit Snowflake for really being the first to architecturally deploy this. And what do I mean by compute storage separation versus the shared nothing architecture, which is where your data is stored in object storage, like S3, GCS, or Azure Blob Storage, and your compute nodes are stateless. And that enables those nodes to automatically idle, to scale up and down, horizontally and vertically, and that brings tremendous cost savings and resource efficiency to an equivalent workload that you would be running in a self-hosted or an on-prem environment. And so we can talk a bit about open source business models and licensing if the audience is interested in it. I think it's less of a charged topic than it was 5 or 6 years ago.
So I'd love to ask about that in just 1 second, but just one follow-on. Typically a user of OLAP was like a user like me or a programmer or something like that, and more we are seeing. I hate the term agents. I promise, I promise, I understand that these things are relatively complex, but more and more like an AI agent will be, interacting with these systems, right? So for example, DBT just released an MCP server, which is okay, so now your agent can go ahead and kind of play around with things. Is there discussions within your company about the shift in the user base? Or do you feel that you're sufficiently low in the stack that like the consumption layer isn't? It's kind of funny because I was thinking about if I was in your place. I'm like, well, I mean, like actually, often you are a piece of core infrastructure, right? And so like whether it's an agent or a human doesn't matter. But we are more and more seeing these things being exposed to agents. And so I'm just wondering if this is a discussion point or is it something you guys have not really?
We talked a bit about the shift in the user base, so let's talk about kind of the persona that typically, evaluates and adopts this technology. And it's evolved, but at the end of the day, it's a software developer, typically, at least for our technology. And there's obviously exceptions to that. And
But that's for building, not necessarily for using, right? Like a software developer will take it and build on it, but then the ultimate user is probably someone that goes to like a dashboard and.
It varies by use case clearly, but if you take a look at some of the examples I referenced and you layer on top of that, like companies like Vantage that does cloud cost optimizations, or Ramp that does expense management, they're using our hosted service ClickHouse Cloud to power a customer-facing analytical workload. So that user profile is going to be very different for those two scenarios. It could be a financial analyst or somebody that's optimizing cloud infrastructure expense. They don't know what the underlying database is that they're using, but they do know that that analytical experience needs to be extremely quick in terms of latency. And so that's a core requirement to all of these use cases, which is, and I think the theme of this is around real time, which is especially when you have this customer-facing application and you've got historical data and data that's streaming in, you need to be able to query both. You've got high concurrency and low latency requirements. It varies based off the user base. The user, of Vercel, for example, that's trying to search on build logs is going to be very different than the user of Weights and Biases Weave product or LangChain's LangSmith service that are also being powered by our managed service. So it really depends on the application. Observability largely are going to be SREs inside of a company that are going to be doing analysis on logs, metrics, or traces. Is going to be very different than the real-time or the cloud data warehouse use case.
Another thing that I actually want to pick your brain on is, for those of you who don't know, that Aaron has long been considered one of the top kind of go-to-market leaders and business leaders in the industry in infrastructure. And so he's actually seen a lot. And one thing that we don't talk enough about this AI wave, it's largely this kind of bottom-up prosumer thing. Like we all talk about it in the enterprise, but the amount of actual enterprise traction relatively is trivial relative to my mom on ChatGPT. Like it's just, like a lot of the dominant use cases are just not core enterprise use cases. It's like create an image and create a video and a bunch of these prosumer use cases. And that's changing, right? Of course, this stuff is going to move into the enterprise, but it's also kind of shaped go-to-market. I sit on a board of a bunch of these companies that are these AI companies, and they're doing great, but they're product-led and it's inbound and it's bottom-up, and they're now trying to learn enterprise, and the enterprise doesn't really understand the technology, and so there's just so much thrash on that side of the world. And so you were at Elastic, and you've seen the transition from on-prem to cloud. You've dealt with open source and bottom-up, and then of course, with ClickHouse, you've got one of the fastest-growing kind of inbound infrastructure engines. And so I think it'd be good I would love to hear how you're thinking about that shift and whether you think there's further disruption or is it pretty standard? Are you seeing disruption around this?
I am. So when we started the company, outside of designing this managed service, we said, all right, what do we want distribution to look like? Obviously open source is an amazing distribution model to get your technology in the hands of consumers in a very frictionless way. But if you actually try to monetize that, what does that experience look like? You could go down the path that Snowflake paved, which is, invest heavily in sales and marketing and go after the enterprise. And it was very effective for them. It took some time and it required a lot of capital. Or you can go down the path, conversely, of a company like Datadog, which really focused on the developer experience and the self-service approach where somebody can evaluate, try, buy your product without ever having to talk to somebody in sales. And that was the latter was the business model that we wanted to pursue. And we intentionally did not hire a lot of sales and marketing people because I didn't want that to be a crutch for this kind of product-led experience. And you had mentioned Postgres, and if you had asked me 3 years ago, what's going to be the number one source of migrations to ClickHouse, I probably would have said, I don't know, there's other open source databases in the OLAP space. We'll migrate those workloads. Maybe eventually, we'll start capturing some Snowflake workloads. I saw it at Elasticsearch, so there's observability migrations. Interestingly enough, fast forward to where we are, if you put aside open source migrations to our cloud service, the number one source of migrations is Postgres.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Which is somebody chose it as the obvious choice, and for whatever reason, it didn't scale as the data volumes grew. And we actually made an acquisition, and the CEO is sitting in the front row, Sai, and he's managing the database track tomorrow. He built a company called PureDB, which established a CDC, change data capture protocol, to get data from a transactional database like Postgres or MySQL or Mongo into ClickHouse, and that's really propelled that type of migration.
Cool. You mentioned open source. So let's imagine someone out here in the audience right now is starting their company, and they decide to do open source. What license should they use? By the way, for open source companies, like, this is a perennial source of conversation, and Volpe is on Volpe's on Aaron's board, and I've in 3 different companies have had this kind of long drawn out. So this is actually turns out to be kind of a very contentious topic. So I'd love to hear where you've come out, since you've seen it now twice.
So my advice to you, if you're thinking about starting an open source company, is don't.
That's all his advice too.
It's tricky. And there's plenty of examples of very successful companies who do not have an open source dimension.
Yeah.
Snowflake and Datadog come to mind. It's probably the 2 most successful infrastructure SaaS companies of the last decade.
Yeah.
And they did not do it through open source. So open source licensing, when I started at Elastic 11 years ago, it was basically AGPL versus Apache. And there were pros and cons to each. And then with the emergence of AWS, and then subsequently Google Cloud and Azure redistributing open source projects, people started moving to the server-side license, which would limit competition of people being able to redistribute your technology. And I would say ClickHouse is probably one of the last remaining open source databases that still is governed by an Apache 2 license for that reason. And we frequently revisit that decision to determine whether or not we should change the license. And we continue to come back to the fact that we think the permissiveness of the Apache 2 license is really fueling a lot of growth and adoption. And that because we have a head start with a managed service, specifically around compute storage separation, with a different table engine that we call shared merge tree, and then a variety of other developments that we've done around security orchestration, ingestion, something we call click pipes, and others that there's other hosted offerings of ClickHouse, obviously, in the market. But we feel like ours is the most resource efficient and cost effective and performant for our customers. And we feel like if we maintain that head start and that competitive lead, then we can continue to support the community's desire to have an Apache 2 project. There are plenty of other open source technologies like Grafana that have been extremely successful with a license change. My prior company, Elastic, has kind of gone back and forth in terms of their decisions around open source licensing. But again, the company's doing over $1 billion of revenue. So I think most people would still consider that a success. So, probably the TLDR is that kind of the religious war around open source licensing, from where I sit, has really softened over the past decade, and consumers and companies care less about what license you use than they did in the past, as long as it's free and as long as they can look at the source code.
Yeah. I gotta say, I've been investing in infrastructure for a decade, hundreds of deals, and And I only do infrastructure. So every reInvent, it's like therapy session, man. Like, oh my goodness, like AWS is competing and they're doing this thing, like every time. And I still to this day don't know of a single data point where like one of these big clouds was successfully able to put a company out of business, right? I mean, I just think it's different customers, their house accounts, like whatever. And so my view is it's kind of an overblown concern, but maybe you have a different, like, do you think that actually the license change is necessary in some cases? I think it's fine to do it. I don't think it hurts the company to do it. I just don't know if it's actually, like there's much data to suggest it actually helps.
I think it comes back to whether or not you believe that you can build a differentiated offering than one of the large hyperscalers can offer by redistributing your technology, and whether or not you believe there should be a breaking glass moment where you perform a license change where like the collective competitive threat of other offerings is cannibalizing your business, and you want to be a long-lasting, sustaining company, and you want to continue to innovate on the technology because that benefits all of the users, it's reasonable to contemplate.
So in your discussions, are you like pro changing the license and your tech people are against it?
It's interesting.
Is that what's happening here?
I'm one of three founders of the company, the creator of ClickHouse, a Russian engineer named Alexei, who lives in the Netherlands with the core team that works on the database itself. Then an individual named Yuri Israelevsky. Yuri is actually on a panel tonight that's being moderated by Mike Driscoll, who's very well known in the data community. Yeah. And if you're available, I would encourage you to go to that panel with some other, leading thought leaders in our industry. And then tomorrow, our head of product, Tanya Bragan, who's one of the smartest people who I've worked with in the last 20 years, is going to be speaking at this conference. And so if you have an opportunity to listen to Tanya, I would absolutely encourage you to do so. The reality is there's no right answer. I mean, there's pros and cons of these different license types. And so then it comes down to, you kind of got to go with your gut. And I defer largely to Alexei in these areas because investors, as you know, are going to say, change the license.
Yeah, every time.
Do whatever you can to monetize and to prevent competition is a reasonable perspective.
Yeah.
But the practitioner who formed the database and wants to see it in the hands of as many users around the world as possible. And the international dimension of this can't be overstated. Our company, we've got over 1,000 customers using our managed service. Over half of those are outside of the United States. Yeah. And that shows up also in the revenue that we source. Over half of our revenue is outside of the United States. And so, being able to drive such, broad international mix across your customer base, I think is really only made possible by these types of distribution models. So Martin, entrepreneur, successful founder, then an operator at VMware, turned venture capitalist.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience, the pros and cons. Would you make the same decision again?
Yeah. I mean, my life, my career is actually very simple. Like in my 20s, I was like a researcher. I wrote papers, I wrote code. Like that's what was my 20s. And then I was actually going to be a professor at Cornell. Like I'd gotten the offer and whatever, but I decided to start a company. And then I started in 2007. Of course, 2008, the end of the world happened, and I was like, man, I'll be such a dick if I leave this team and go be a professor. So I turned down the faculty offer and I stayed and did Nasira. Thought we were dead so many times, but that was from 30 to 40. I just did this one company. That's all I did from that time. And kind of two things happened where I'm like, okay, I've had my time. One of them is I've been traveling so much because when you grow at the time, you don't do it so much lately, but at the time when you grow a company globally, you're on the road all the time because being in person was so important, and we're really growing. We grew it from 30 million to 600 million in 3 years. We're just such big growth. And I remember I had just taken a trip into Asia, and I flew into SFO here, and the driver picked me up, and I'm like, dude, I do not want to go to my house, man. It's gonna be cold. There's gonna be no food, whatever. So I had him drive me to the W here in San Francisco. I'm like, what am I doing with my life, man? I'm like I just arrived here, and I'm going to a hotel. I'm not even gonna go to my house. And then, listen, I also, did the thing which many people have done, which I woke up and I didn't even know which where I was. It turned out it was Shanghai, but like I literally had to call the front desk and they thought I was asking what room I was in. So like 10 years of this, and you've done it. Like I was like, okay, listen, like I've done it. Like I feel proud of what we did. And so, so then I transitioned over being a VC, but the way I view it is I've kind of zoomed out on abstraction levels. Like it's like, okay, like my abstraction level was like, it's a research problem, it's a product, it's a project. And then, you become a founder of a company, and then the abstraction level is a business and it's P&L and, it's a product portfolio, which is one level of abstraction up. And by the way, the problems aren't any more or less complex when you move up a level of abstraction. Like they're just as intellectually complicated, they're just as adaptive. And then, listen, I go to the end of that and I'm like, listen, I am so enamored with tech and I'm so enamored with infrastructure. It's my true love. Like I love it. I love the startup ecosystem. And so but do I want to go back and do the same thing again? No, so I decided to be a VC. And so the abstraction level comes up and becomes a company, right? And so now my abstraction level is seeing the interactions of companies. And so it's been a very natural progression. I'm very lucky to work with a bunch of operators. And so, I think I would go nuts if I, was working with a traditional finance shop, but they're all operators. And so it's been great. Yeah, thanks so much.